Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to today's session of the Institute's Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series featuring Professor Carlo Cereti of the University of California, Irvine, who will be speaking on Eschatology and Apocalyptic Literature in the Zoroastrian context. Welcome to Toronto and North America, Professor Cereti. I'm convening the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series with my colleagues, Professor Enrico Raffaelli and Professor Miguel Angel Toledo, the Faizana Professor in Zoroastrian Languages and Literature at the University of Toronto. We are grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, the Zoroastrian Federation of North America, and Zoroastrian Society of Ontario for co-sponsoring this monthly lecture series. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Miguel Angel Toledo, will introduce our distinguished colleague, Professor Cereti, and will moderate today's session. Professor Toledo.
Thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli. It is a great pleasure having Professor Cereti today in our Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series. He's a very well-known scholar for all of you, probably, so he doesn't need actually a very long introduction, but I will say the most important details about his very long and very important, very relevant career in the field. Carlo Cereti, Professor Cereti, has recently joined the University of California in Irvine as the Ferdowsi Presidential Chair in Zoroastrian Studies and also Professor of Classics and Religions. He was also, before, since 2000, full Professor of Iranian Studies at La Sapienza in Rome, the University La Sapienza in Rome, in the Department of Ancient World Studies. He has published a lot of very important books, articles on many different topics related to Zoroastrianism. His earliest research work focused mainly on the history of the Zoroastrian Parsi community. In India, he published a very important edition of the Kiseye Sanjan, as you know, an intellectual interest that continued throughout his academic career. So in time, his main research field shifted to Middle Iranian languages and literatures, and more especially to the study of Zoroastrian literature in Middle Persian. Among many other important publications, he's also the author of La Literatura Pahlavi, the Pahlavi literature. He also has published and studied a lot of medieval and modern history of the Zoroastrian community, combined with an intimate knowledge of the Zoroastrian Middle Persian literature, and specifically of the Sasanian and post-Sasanian written culture. He has worked on the Bundahishn. He has worked also on Pahlavi epigraphy, on many texts on the material culture also. And among other things, he has published also a very important edition of the Zani Bahman Yasin. And he's working recently on a new edition of Narses by Guli's inscription and other epigraphic texts, including seals and sealings, as well as ostraca and documents, mainly dating to the late Sasanian and early Islamic periods. Again, we could mention many more publications, many more important things of Professor Cereti's CV, but we will be delighted in listening to his talk. So please, Professor Cereti, the floor and now the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel Angel. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your very kind words, and thank you to all of you for being here, and in general to the University of Toronto for inviting me. I mean, I have visited Toronto in a very important moment of my life, because I was in Toronto when I got a call from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Italy telling me that I had been chosen to be cultural attaché in Tehran, where I spent 8 years. And now my first public event after coming to North America is with Toronto. So I think that Toronto is somehow in my destiny. And I'm glad of it. Of course, it was more pleasant to be in Toronto than to be online with Toronto, but still, what can one do? And also, I wish to say hello to Maria Subtelny, who was our host at that time, and to Enrico Raffaelli. Now, let me see if I am able to do this. Yes, I hope. So, today's lecture will build on some work that I have been doing in recent years, and that has been also the subject of some articles published or soon to be published. And it focuses on the idea of the end in Zoroastrianism. It's not by chance that to start the conference, the talk, I chose a photo of Takht Suleiman. Because in my opinion, Takht Suleiman, the great temple of late Sasanian time, is absolutely central to what we know of as apocalyptic literature dating from the late Sasanian period. And you will see that at the end of the conference, there is a Middle Persian, a Pahlavi passage speaking of Lake Shechast, deep and of warm waters, which seems to me to fit much better the small lake at Takht Suleiman than the Urumiyeh lake, which is all but not deep. So I will start by defining the words I use in this conference, because I think that in this talk, because I think that a lot of confusion that has been going on, especially some years ago, about how to see the end of the world depends on how one interprets the words. And being Italian, I took a definition from an Italian online dictionary that says that eschatology derives from Greek eschatos, last, final, end, and logos, discourse. It is the doctrine of the last things. That is that part of religious beliefs that discusses the final fate either of humankind as a whole, on the whole, or of each of us. On the contrary, apocalypsis, that comes directly from Latin, apocalypsis, then from Greek, a word which basically means revelation, is a title that was used initially to design some writings in the Judaic and Christian tradition, either canonical or apocryphal, that contained revelations concerning the ultimate destinies of humankind. Now, of course, this is the original meaning of the word. And then apocalypse has been used to define the end of the world. I mean, think of the movie of Apocalypse Now, how it is used. And that has given room to some equivocal interpretations, and also rise to some of the discussion that has been done about Zoroastrian eschatology. Now, if one starts from a definition in a relatively recent book by Jason Silverman, you can see that these things have, in a way, merged together. And I agree very much with him when he says that much, but I do not agree with him when he says that, in his opinion, it is redundant to speak about an apocalyptic eschatology. And as a matter of fact, I think what we have in late Zoroastrianism, that is in Sasanian Zoroastrianism, is basically apocalyptic eschatology, and it's something that, of course, separates my approach very much from the approach of, for example, Mary Boyce, which has a less historical interpretation of Zoroastrianism. I mean, she sees Zoroastrianism as basically having changed very little through history. There is one point I think that is important to say here, and that is that while in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in general in the Semitic tradition, the encounter and the revelation comes mainly through prophecy, but prophecy is something which is very typical of that religious tradition. The encounter with the numinous, the encounter with the divine level in Zoroastrianism and in other contexts can also consist of a ritual or ecstatic perception of the same. And I go on to say that basically what I do is to accept let's say, the definition by Gignoux, which translated into English more or less reads, in the Iranian world, while maintaining the kinship of the terms apocalypse and apocalyptics and eschatology, it seems appropriate to define eschatology as a set of doctrines that are central to the Mazdian religion in relation to the genesis of the world and its history, thus forming part of a mythology or cosmogony that can be traced back to Zoroaster and has in any case profoundly marked all Mazdian thought and ethics. The term apocalypse could never therefore be reserved for a more restricted field, that of predictions made after their fulfillment, vaticinia ex eventu, of historical events that foreshadows the catastrophes at the end of time. So as you see, on the one side, you have a context that is more closely linking to mythology, and you have a second context that is more closely linked to history. We all know that in the Iranian context, especially thanks to Zamyād Yašt studies and so on, the idea national history is somehow a combination of mythology and history, or of translated mythology, which is found in the first half of the Shahnameh, and let's say ethic or moral history, which is in the second part, in the part of the Shahnameh that deals with the Sasanian Empire. And I mean, the relation between mythology and a sort of national history is found also, for example, in the Indian context between the Vedas, or the Rig Veda, and the Mahabharata, and so on. But we could, lose a lot of time. I mean, we could talk of this subject for a lot of time. Now, my idea is that basically what we are dealing with is something closer to the late antique and medieval traditions that we find in various contexts in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. And a scholar who is active, I believe, in Canada, I forget the university, Lorenzo Di Tommaso, written together, which strikes to me as Italian to be very strange, but the name is written so. He has studied medieval apocalyptics and basically spotted 5 characteristics that this tradition shares. Its global geographic scope, its historical eschatological tenor, its recombinatory compositional process, its distinctive eschatological narrative, which somehow repeats number 2, and its boundary crossing ability, which is close to number 1. Now, if one looks at the Avesta, at the Zend Avesta in itself, you can see, thanks to Götz Koenig's, and not only his studies, I mean, Alberto Cantera and so on, that you have a number of different canonizations of the Avesta. Not only the ones that have taken place in the first millennium BCE and that have been highlighted by persons like Jean Kellens, but especially, I would say, by Javier Tremblay, a gifted colleague that is no more among us. But we also have, and I mean, the person that has studied this more in detail in the recent period is Götz Koenig. We also have different stages. We also know of different stages of Avestan transmission that are found that belong to the Sasanian period. So Ardashir and Tosar, 3rd century, Shabur, second half of the 3rd century, Shabur the second, and Adurbad, 4th century, and Khosrow the first in the 6th century. We are, I mean, it's important to understand what this corresponds to in overall historical period. So overall historical period modeled on Roman history, which of course should be adapted to other contexts. Shammuz II corresponds, Shammuz II's reign corresponds to the time in which we had the Nicaea Council for the Christians. That is the moment in which the Christian church somehow felt strong enough to present itself as a growing universal faith, and therefore, at a period in which the challenge to Zoroastrianism and other ancient religion was posed in a very serious way, and the period, the Sasanian period, corresponds to what most people would consider to be late antiquity, according to this terminology that is quite that many people use and invest upon. So, I mean, what we are speaking of now is something that happened after the peak of the classical war. And Koenig goes on saying that in his reconstruction, there are at least two canons that are found in this context. One in the 4th century, and one is the response to Khosrow, Khosrow's response to the Mazdakite crisis. And we will see that this Mazdakite crisis, in my opinion, is really a turning point also for apocalyptics. What was the procedure that one used when dealing with these aspects? As I mean, Zoroastrian's priests were, first of all, priests, and they applied the same exegetical methodology that priests apply while commenting the Bible, or especially in the Shia world, but that apply when understanding the Quran. That is, they started from the holy text and tried to see. Now, I mean, of course, a priest would not see the things as I am explaining them now, and try to read contemporary beliefs in the holy and in the holy text. And this is something that, for example, Johann Weweiner has demonstrated very well in his PhD thesis, which is now about to be, or has now been published, and in a number of articles. He had focused on a specific Avestan prayer, the Aryaman, that has been commented upon in Sasanian times, and that left some trace in Denkat 9. And what Denkat 9 shows is that the idea of the existence of an universal eschatology, the Soshans and so on, was built in the commentary to this passage. This somehow was already understood by Molay, that has been probably the most influential and person to work on Zoroastrianism in the 60s, and unfortunately he could not complete his work because of early death. But what he says is basically that while the Ahunvar is linked to the beginnings and its recitation is part of the creative act of the universe, the Aryama Isho prayer that closes the collection is intimately linked to the events of the last days, to the renovation of existence. So, I mean, a way to see the text as a representation of history, the text as a representation of the cosmology. Now let's turn, and I finally have some photos because Mohammed Tavakoli at the beginning remarked that I had only text, which is unfortunately the way philologists, the boring way in which philologists and historians somehow work. We turn to the Helmand. Now the Helmand is very important for Zoroastrian history. It is very important for the Helmand, and Sistan is very important for Iranian national history, because I mean it is the home of Rostam, it is the home of the main hero of the Shahnameh, and it's also important for Italians, much less in a way, because it is the place where Italian archaeological and historical studies on Iran started in 1958, thanks to Tucci. Gherardo Agnoli worked on Sistan as a possible homeland of Zoroaster, whether this really was the home of Zoroaster, whether it was farther to the north, whether we can really spot a human being called Zoroaster is something that cannot be discussed here. So I believe, being a follower of Croce more than Marx, that such an individual existed, but this is really not the subject of this talk. What happens in the Helmand? The Helmand is between the Hindu Kush and the Iranian desert. It is a land that was full of water. It is the home to a lake that stood in the middle of the desert and of a basalt mountain or hill that rose at the center of this desert. It is the ideal pilgrimage place, and has been shown by people like Scarcia, but also Boyce and Grenet in their volume, in the third part of Boyce's work on the history of Zoroastrianism. It was also an important pilgrimage place even before the coming of the Zoroastrians, of the Iranians. And at the center of this lake, which is not anymore there, as you can see from one of these photos, stands Kuekhajeh, one of the most impressive monuments in the world. I mean, when you reach Kuekhajeh and see it from afar, when approaching by car, the experience is really absolutely incredible. This area is the place where one of the old and great Avesta Yashts was set. And this, I mean, according to Almut Hinze, who published what still is the reference edition of the text, according to her, this is a yasht that may be slightly later than what other yashts are. It is a yasht that may have been composed as late as the 6th century BCE, which would make it a contemporary of whatever was going on in Sistan at the time of the rise of the Achaemenid Empire. The other text which we're going to talk about is the 7th book of the Denkard. The 7th book of the Denkard is something that was finally written in the 9th century, but probably on the basis of a legend that has basically reached its mature form towards the end of the Sasanian period. Anyhow, after, at least that is what I believe, after the Mastak's movement and rebellion and so on. Again, Mollet, in his posthumous edition of the Pahlavi text, published in 1967 by Demenash, who had been his professor, has shown that there is a very close parallel between the final days of the Zamyād Yašt and chapter 11 of the 7th book of the Denkard. Again, these are the two texts in the parallel, transcription and then translation. And what is interesting, in my opinion, is that the lack of correspondence between what Hinze translates as eyes of insight and what is found in the Denkard, that talks of a person, of someone rising and looking and observing through his 6 eyes, is something that is really rooted in the textual tradition. Because if you look at the textual tradition, of course, as we see it now, we see that both manuscripts F1 and L18, that is F1 especially, is the most important the most important text. They show a lacuna, a hole between ch and sh, and this has already been amended by one manuscript, PT1, as kshash. I mean, this is something I take from Hinze's 1994 edition. So this shows that a reading Shwash 6 was already, I mean, this combined with evidence in the Denkard shows that the reading Shish has somehow crept very early in the tradition. So this is for one development that I would call basically emic eschatology. I mean, the internal development that brought to an eschatological narration in Zoroastrianism. If we look, on the contrary, to the apocalyptic text, Zamyād Yašt, but also Bundahishn, Ayat Garijama Speak, and so on. First of all, we see the use of pseudo-epigrapha. The first 3 chapters in today's standard edition of the Zamyād Yašt all start by saying, we took this text from the Zendavest. Shion as Stuttgart, Heidag, Pad Zamyād Yašt, ud Hojdad Yašt, ud Ashtad Yašt, Peidag Ku, Pad Zamyād Yašt, Peidag Ku. So, the structure of the Zamyād Yašt, for those who are less confident with it, presents 2 chapters, the first and the second, which are not really part of the narration of the Zamyād Yašt. Then, with the 3rd chapter, the narration becomes continuing. What is interesting is that in the 1st chapter, we find the scheme of the 4 epochs. That is the one on which most commentators, most modern scholars have focused. And in the 2nd chapter, where it says, according to the author of the Zamyād Yašt, it is said in the Zam of the Vahman Yašt, and of the Hojdad Yašt, and of the Ashtad Yašt, as if it were repeated in the Zendavest. What is narrated is basically the episode of Masdati Bamdadan, showing how central this was to the birth of apocalyptic imagination. And again, what happens in this narration? What happens is that Zoroaster seeks immortality from Ormazd, and Ormazd says, okay, you cannot be immortal, but what I can give you is omniscience. You can know what will happen in the future. And this happens through an ecstatic voyage determined by the use of some substance. Ormazd put his wisdom of omniscience in the form of water on the hand of Zarathustra and said, drink. And of course, this brings to the mind the Ardaviraf. And the fact that it brings to the mind the Ardaviraf, individual eschatology, allows us to somehow date, at least to fix a date by which this phenomenon, this kind of ritual, is known to have happened in the 3rd century, when Kirdir was active, and when Kirdir, between the 20s and the early 70s of the 3rd centuries, Anders Shapur wrote his, Anders Shapur performed a ritual that he then described in 2 of his inscriptions, one of which is well, you can't see it, but is in the photos that you are seeing, a photo that appears, as a matter of fact, near a beautiful bas-relief by Bahram II, which may also be interpreted as defending his Dana, and not only as defending his queen. And here, what is said that, and I mean, this text, I lost the text, okay. And the text describes a ceremony by which Kirdir, during the reign of Shabu II, sends some rehig, whatever this means, to the other world to describe what will happen after this. So we know that this kind of ecstatic trips are attested at least from the 3rd century. Then, if we look at the reconstruction of the different schemes of the ages that we find in Zoroastrian literature, we have one in Zamyād Yašt chapter 1, which basically says Zoroaster and Vishtasp, then Artaxerxes, whoever he was, the Kayanid king, then Khosrow, and then the end. Another one found in the Denkat, which is relatively close to this. We are talking of different subjects, again, for epochs. And then we have the two more important ones, at least according to my idea, and it is the division in 7 epochs. In the Zamyād Yašt, Vishtasp are the Shirikai, the Arsacid kings misplaced. Vahramgor, very curious choice for a king. Khosrow Kavadan, and then times. In Denkat 4, talking of the transmission of the religion, Vishtasp, Darai Darayan, again, reflecting the memory, the faint memory of the Achaemenid period. Valachi Ashkanan, which corresponds to the epoch that has been misplaced in the Zamyād Yašt, but we will talk about that in a moment. Vahramgor, Shabur II, Khosrow, Vahramgor, Shabur I, Khosrow, Shabur II, and again, Khosrow, this king, Khosrow, king of kings, son Kabad. So you see that there is roughly a correspondence. Now, what is the problem that we have in the list of the Zamyād Yašt with the Sassids and Alexandrine Kilisei? First of all, it is misplaced. And so something must have gone wrong. But the second thing is that the descriptions found in the Zamyād Yašt says the one of brass is the reign of the Sassanid kings who will rid the world of the heresy of the Buddha, and by whom the evil Alexander the Ecclesiastic, Alexander the Ecclesiastic. Alexander is never called the ecclesiastic except in this text. Normally he's called Chromaig, Rumi, Gizistag, accursed, insulted in all ways, but he's never called with this term Kilisei that I think Wiedengren even tried to explain as linked to the name of Keresaspa. The one who is always called Kilisei is Shedas Ikilisaiig. That is a term that refers to a Byzantine emperor, and most probably to the Byzantine emperor who did unleash hell on the Sasanian Empire, and who was Heraclius, the emperor that by, defeating Khosrow II, de facto started the final epoch of the Sasanian Empire. Of course, in the Zamyād Yašt, there are also descriptions pertaining to later period. The one you see on the screens pertains much more to the period post Yazdegerd III, when what remained of the Sasanian family had moved further on to the east. But if you look at the description of the end of Khosrow's, of the end of Zoroaster's millennium and the coming of Ushedar, that is the first of the three future saviors, we always have a triad that are the Turk, the Tazic, and the Romaic. The Turks, the Arabs, and the Romans, which fits much better the situation in the period of Khosrow II, when in fact it was the alliance between the Hakan and the Khazar that led to the defeat of the Sasanians. And this you find it also in other texts and in the seventh book of the Zenka, when Zardusht asked, "How much will you inflict? How long will you inflict us with these kind of people?" And I think there is one passage in the Ayat Gari drama speak that clearly points to this, and it is when the Ayat Gari speaks of Oi I Abarves Huadai and Dar Zamyād, who will conquer many cities, that victorious Lord. It has been interpreted in many different ways, but Abarves is the name given, is the title given to Khosrow Parviz, that is Khosrow II, and it is Khosrow Parviz who conquered cities and strongholds across the Byzantine Empire, reaching Jerusalem, taking the true cross, and so on. So now I see that I am out, more or less, out of time. And I just want to very shortly say once more that, of course, central to this, as I said in the beginning, is the episode of Mazda, but we will not focus on it. And just to conclude and to see the correspondence between Di Tommaso's criteria and what we have here. Di Tommaso says medieval apocalyptics is characterized by its global geographic scope. And here we have a narration that expands over the entire Iranian realm and beyond, and which presents similarities with other traditions of the same age. Medieval tradition is historical and eschatological at one time. And here we see all our apocalypses, not our eschatologies, are presented as part of world history, part of real existing world history. It's recombinatory compositional process. That is, I mean, the thing that tricked persons like Widengren and even Mary Boyce to say it is ancient is the fact that you find ancient elements used in these in apocalyptic text. But this also is a characteristic of medieval apocalyptic. You use earlier elements that were used in a different way and in a different context, and you make them the building blocks to build a new narration. And that is what happens once more in our Zoroastrian tradition. It is eschatological. It waits for an end and for our final and better destiny. And therefore, it is part of a more general teleological worldview. And it's also characterizing by the fact and this corresponds somehow to point one, to the fact that some of the traces of these aspects are probably to be seen, but this is a theme that I would like to work more on in Byzantine authors dating from the period of Heraclius, when there was a large use both of the church as a sponsor of the campaigns of Christian ideology against the onslaught of of Khosrow, and he's taking the Holy Cross from Jerusalem, and of course of apocalyptic narrations in somber colors to motivate the army. So this is what I wanted to say more or less today. Of course, it is let's say building on much work that I have been doing before, and that some of you may be partly acquainted of. And anyhow, thank you very much. Next time, hopefully in Toronto live.
Thank you very much, Professor Cereti. Now we have 15 to 20 minutes for some questions, and some of you already wrote in the chat, but we would start, if you don't mind, by Maria Saptelny, who raised her hand.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. There was a lot of text to absorb. It would be wonderful if we could have it made available so we could study it more closely. But you started with the image of the site of the old fire of Adur-Gushnasp, right, at Shiz. And I think there was a reference in one of the texts, I just caught it very quickly, to warm water. And that, of course, was a volcanic lake and would have warm water. So are you suggesting that the site of that mythic lake, which maybe was regarded as being in Helmand, is actually at Takht Suleiman?
No, I'm not suggesting this. What I suggest and what I think has happened, and there are a couple of articles by Gianfilippo Terribili on the subject, recent article, is that each, or at least many, of the Zoroastrian, of the important Zoroastrian temples in Iran rebuilt a sort of mythical geography around themselves. So I have worked a bit more on Sistan. It would be a phenomenon that is similar to what happens in many pilgrimage places. I'm thinking of, for example, in North Italy, there are various places called Sacromonte, Holy Mount. As a matter of fact, there are also now UNESCO sites. And there are places, pilgrimage places built on the model of Jerusalem, so that people from northern Italy or from Europe could do a pilgrimage there as if going to Jerusalem. I mean, the same thing happened to me when I went to Shah Abdolazim in Tehran, and on the door of Shah Abdolazim there is a writing, I don't remember the Persian, but it says basically, whoever came to Shah Abdolazim is as if he went to Karbala, and I have been called Karbalai by the drivers of the Italian embassy in Rome for 8 years after telling them this thing. So I mean, the idea is not that Adur-Gushnasp corresponds to the real lake, but that the narration of the priest active at Adur-Gushnasp, which was the most important temple, at least in the Sasanian West, from the late 4th century onwards, was that it was that their lake was in fact the lake where the seed of Zoroaster is kept.
Okay.
Yes, that is what I think.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the one thing is there's a lot of tradition, of later tradition, locating Zoroaster in the West. Most of this tradition says that Lake Chechast would be Lake Urumie, but Lake Urumie does not correspond to the short description that we have in this text. which may or may not mean something.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Firdosh Mehta, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, could we suppose that the common apocalyptic eschatology, as we kind of understand, it is contemporary to Gothic understand of pre-Achaemenid? But with
Sorry,
a difference,
I didn't get of Cereti, you said?
yes, like is that the apocalyptic view of the Gathas, but with a different and positive perspective reflected on the nature of our Mazda as being non-destructive? Like we do not assume the world will be blown up in apocalyptic. If you can help me understand that, that will be appreciated. Thank you.
Let's say, I mean, in general, what I think is that we have, let's say, thinking in models. We have some sort of eschatology in Iran that probably goes back to the teachings of the Prophet himself, or immediately afterwards. I mean, the real, at least to my eyes, but I'm not a specialist of that part. We can trace the tradition at least until the young Avestan period. Whether this has a correspondence in the texts of the old Avestan period, especially the Gathas, is more can be discussed. Anyhow, I am quite convinced that some eschatology is present for certain in the Zamyād Yašt, so in a very early period, and that this eschatology, the one that you would define as the positive eschatology, found its way changing its form and changing its interpretation, as it happens in religion, at least from my point of view, change its evolution, but survived until the early Islamic period. Moreover, there are many different forms of representation of the end of time, which live one by the other, and this also is a characteristic of many religions. I mean, it's what I called apocalyptic, in my opinion, was mainly a pseudo-political literature used to justify and motivate oppositions to Rome first and to Islam afterwards. There is a tradition studied recently in a number of articles and books by Antonio Panaino that refers more to apokatastasis, that is the destruction of the world through fire or metal. So what I'm saying, there are many different traditions in Zoroastrianism, and they probably evolved through a circular process that invested also other ancient tradition, Judaism, early Christianity, and so on. But that always in the case of Zoroastrian and Iranian texts, always declined the narration according to Iranian materials. I mean, they did not simply import or exchange, but they used their own material to deliver more or less the same message.
Would something be there in the Happenheiti that will help me understand better?
I don't know. I mean, it's really it's a bit. I would look more at the young Avesta than the Yasna Happenheiti.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your explanation.
Thank you very much. Now we have a double question by Dr. Karishma. You can formulate the questions if you want.
Litargi and Professor Andreas. You bring us the most amazing speakers, and today I'd like to request our speaker to please comment on what you, Professor Cereti, understand by the eschatology in the Ahad Yamaishia prayer. There is a reason I'm asking this. Mabed Sufi Dastur, a very understanding Mabed who was very keen on teaching, summarized the Ahad Yamaishia prayer as the brotherhood of mankind, with the essence to me as men and women who live a life of the good mind towards righteousness, that being the essence of the prayer. So what is your reference to eschatology in that? That's my first part of my question.
Yes, it's a reference. It's not to the prayer itself, because the prayer stands as it stands, and that's fine. It is a it is a reference to the commentary. The idea is not mine; it's Johann Weiner who put it forward. So I'm only repeating it in a context. But the idea is that since it is at the end of the Gathas, it is conceived as being in a representation of the holy text that corresponds to a representation of ritual, that in its turn corresponds to a representation of universal history. It would have been proper for a commentator of the Sasanian period to link it with eschatology, but it does not go on the substance on the meaning of the Western prayer itself.
Okay, Professor. Now coming back to what you mentioned in the Zamyād Yašt, I'll be very brief about this because there are other questions from other people. You referenced a paragraph that suggests that Zarathustra asked Ahura Mazda for immortality. However, to me, a Gatha verse 28.8 gives it more meaning in the spirituality, because that verse says, Vispai Yahweh Vangeush Manango, asking not just for himself, but for his followers, the concept of Maibyo. I ask not for me, but for me and my followers. For the good mind, eternally. And this concept of eternally in the context of eschatology, as I understand it, links to the two types of time in Zoroastrianism, which comes back in the Bundaishan too. It comes in a prayer very meaningfully. The Jasami Avange Mazda, which says, Zarvane Akarne, Zarvane Darego Kadatehe. Time and time, endless time, forever. So the quest of Zoroastrianism of the prophet, is it really for immortality or immortality of the good mind? How do you see this in the context of eschatology?
I mean, of course, what we are dealing with here is something, I mean, I think one should be careful in distinguishing Zoroaster's message and what happened later. I remember that a close friend who was passed away, Farrokh Bajifdar, when we spoke about the discussions that were going on within the Zoroastrian community, or that had gone on within the Zoroastrian community in the 19th and then the 20th century, he gave me a book. I don't remember the title was Drudgery Divine, but it was a book basically illustrating what has gone on in the discourse within Christianity between Protestants, Calvinists, Catholics, and so on. So the problem is, how do we see the Zoroastrian tradition. Do we see it like Boyce did? Zoroastrianism is extremely conservative, so we have to find the same things at all stages. Or do we see it, as I would prefer to see it, as a religion that lasted 3 millennia and changed during this period? So one thing is Zoroaster, one thing are the Gathas, and there again, I mean, you can see the Gathas from the point of view of Kellens, who is a Marxist and sees ritual. You can see it from the point of view of Taraporevala, which sees completely different things. You can see it from the point of view of Humbat, that still tries to bring some ethics in that. So it's, I mean, Gathas is really, I must say, Miguel Angel will not agree with me, but I always quote a saying by Walter Bruno Henning, who was not the kindest of human beings, who said, I will never work on the Gathas because working on the Gathas is bound to drive a man crazy, which is true because there are so many different possibilities that really, especially for someone coming from Middle Iranian, it really, well, I mean, establishing the real meaning has a lot of variance. But one said this, what Zoroastrian tradition of late antiquity and what the legend or the hagiography of Zoroaster as narrated in the 7th book of the Denkat, in the Zardoshnameh and so on, talks of is immortality. And it is also evident from other episodes when Zoroaster, when Vishtas asks for immortality, but God does not give him immortality, omniscience, and so on, but God sort of gives one boon each. So that is the way it was understood when these texts were written. Of course, what Zoroaster said is found somewhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time just for two very brief questions, one on the chat and another one by Manek Puchpala. The one on the chat is, you mentioned that the commentaries of the three Avestan books on the Gathas, Sudgar, Vashmansar, and Bhakt Nasks, have an apocalyptic nature not present in the Avesta. From what I have heard, these Denka summaries of the Zen commentaries often have reconstructible Avestan texts within them. Do you know if these apocalyptic mentionings in the Denka summaries have reconstructible Avestan text, or is that not discernible? Thank you.
Now, again, we are talking of Denkat 9, and Denkat 9 contains, in respect to Denkat 8, it contains a more detailed resume of the commentaries of three commentaries, and it's not in their entirety. They are not eschatological. I mean, these commentaries are not eschatological in their entirety, but it is the commentary to the Erman or Ariaman that contains some eschatological information. And in respect to that, the answer is yes and no. Of course, we have the Avestan is the Ariaman, but we don't have an underlying Avestan to the eschatological part, unless you understand it as we are understanding it now.
Thank you very much. And the last question by Manek Pushpala, please, you can formulate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for a nice presentation, Professor Cereti. I just wanted to kind of confirm your very interesting point you made about how in North Italy, they have reproduced some kind of a site, that is similar to something in Jerusalem. And that, in the birthplace of my father, Bhuj, Kutch in northwest India, there is a kind of a similar thing done for a Muslim saint. They have recreated a kind of a dargah or tomb that is originally is in Baghdad, Iraq. So, so, so were you also mentioning some specific site in Iran or Afghanistan that is like something like that, or what?
Thank you for the confirmation and the very interesting information about India. I hope to be able. I often traveled to India years ago, and I hope to be now able, since California is midway, to go back to India more often, and maybe to visit the site. Now, the three, let's say, I think, and I have written an article about it, that there is such a holy geography in Sistan. There are two articles by Gianfilippo Terribili that were published in a journal called Vicino Oriente, which is open access on the web. So one just Googles Vicino Oriente journal, you can find it there, where he has focused on similar holy geographies around Adur-Gushnasp, that is in Azerbaijan, and, if I'm not wrong, in Khorasan. Now, of course, the problem of, Khorasan is the site. One would expect it to be the site of Adur-Burs and Mir. And now there is an extremely interesting excavation led by one of the best young Iranian archaeologists, Meysam Labaf, who has Meysam Labaf Khaniki, who in fact is working on a site. It is difficult to say whether it is Adur-Burs and Mir, but on the site of a major Sasanian fire in Khorasan, about 80 kilometers south of Mashhad, and a place that has an important spaces for the fire, and a number of inscriptions, of ink inscriptions left by pilgrims. So whatever it is an important site. In the early Islamic period, probably this, or maybe existed also before, but it gained in importance in the early Islamic period. One such temple must have been in Padishwargar, that is in the in what in Islamic sources is called Tabarestan, south between the Albos and the Caspian seashore. So yes, there are places in Iran, and these places also shift in importance and place according to political circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but there is a very last question. If it is short, please, Katsuyo Motoyoshi, can you formulate it?
Yes, thank you very much. I tried to make it short. There was a reference to Golden Age, Silver Age, etc. That sounded very Greek to me. And is that something that was in the Zoroastrian tradition itself, or is it something that was imported? And I'm interested in the sort of the general structure of the conception of time, temporality in the tradition, and if you see any kind of Indo-European structure antecedent in that type of thinking about time in Zoroastrian tradition. Sorry that if it's not very clear, but
let's say, the idea of the Four Ages, if this is what you are referring,
Yes.
has been, especially the one of the Four Ages, gold, silver, brass, or copper, and iron, or mixed iron, whatever, has been discussed very much especially in the 90s. And basically, what was said, I mean, there were different positions about it, but some carried back to Hesiod, and therefore to an Indo-European background. Others thought that it was closer to Daniel, and as a matter of fact, this went two ways. Those who thought that Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism said, well, it's clearly Zoroastrian. We have it in the Zamyād Yašt. The Zamyād Yašt is a commentary to the Avesta, Yašt to Bahman, and therefore it is attested earlier than Daniel. This was one theory. The other theory was Philippe Gignoux, who put it the other way around. He said the term of mixed iron fits better the image of a statue, as is found in Daniel. And therefore the influence is not from an Indo-European model to Zoroastrianism, that is a survival of an Indo-European model, but this outside influence by the Judaic tradition on Zoroastrianism, and specifically this idea of the shoes. Again, some have, but I don't precisely remember which line of argumentation. Some others have linked the four epochs to the Mahabharata, which is, and this also would speak in favor of an inherited model. So, I mean, the idea of the Four Ages, which is not, at least in my opinion, not entirely central to Iranian Zoroastrian apocalyptic speculation, is part of a larger panorama. Whether that is European, Indo-European or not, it's a bit more complicated to say. In general, I mean, my idea, and not only more people are thinking it in this manner nowadays, is that probably there was a circulation of ideas and structures that then each one described, I mean, narrated in a different way. So this is more or less the general idea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you. And of course, especially thank you to Professor Cereti for this wonderful talk and for answering all the questions. And with this, we finish, and I leave the last words to Professor Tavakkoli-Talgi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Cereti, for your fascinating lecture and for your illuminating presentation that included a lot of actually texts, images, and we look forward to seeing you again in Toronto soon. And
Well,
thank you also to everyone who attended today's fascinating lecture.
thank you, Professor Tavakkoli. Thank you, Professor Toledo, and thank you, all of you. And of course, I hope to see you in Irvine and to be in Toronto as soon as possible.
Very good.
Looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.